All right. Well, I think we've got a pretty good, decent starting group. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and introduce us and then we'll get started. First of all, for everyone that's joining, thank you so much for joining us. This is the first State of Flex webinar. I'm incredibly excited today because we've got two fantastic leading voices that are with me up here. Nick Bloom, professor at Stanford, I think on just about every publication's top, however many for whatever future of work voices type list. So Nick, thank you for being here. And Debbie, managing director and senior partner at Boston Consulting Group. So two fantastic folks to join me today. All right. A few housekeeping notes just before we get started so everybody knows. One, the way we'll do today, the format is going to be brief presentations. So we'll each talk through some of the most interesting data points and trends that we're seeing in flexible work. It should take about a little less than half of our time. And then the remaining 30 minutes we're going to do is Q&A and discussion. So in that regard, everyone should see the Q&A button at the bottom right now. Feel free to ask questions at any point. You can start writing in questions now along the way. You can also react to other people's questions and give thumbs up, for example. We will look at that to get a good sense of which questions or topics are most in demand or most interesting, and we'll use that to prioritize the list as we get into questions after the presentations. One other quick point, the session is recorded, and so we will put a link to the session on our FlexIndex site. We will also email it out in our next FlexIndex newsletter. And so if any of your colleagues couldn't make it or you want to share it around, you'll be able to do so after the fact. All right. So with that, we will go ahead and get started and share the presentation. All right. So maybe a little bit about me just to kick off. So I'm the CEO and co-founder at Scoop. At Scoop, we build software to enable hybrid teams. So teams in 20 countries on 6 continents use Scoop to better coordinate their time in the office and how they approach hybrid work. Scoop is also the creator of the Flex Index. The Flex Index is a global repository of company office requirements. And so we track more than 6,500 companies across 45,000 plus offices. Those companies employ more than 100 million people globally. And we write reports on a monthly basis on key trends and how flexible work is evolving. Lastly, I host a podcast called Flex Perspectives, where I interview thought leaders and executives shaping the future of work. Nick Bloom and others have been guests. Feel free to check it out on any platform that you use for podcasts. So on the first slide, we released our latest Flex report on Tuesday of this week. Here are some of the most important findings. First, we are finding that full-time in office as a percentage of U.S. companies is decreasing year to date through 2023. This chart that you're looking at shows blue line, which is what percentage of companies in the U.S. industry weighted using the current population survey offer work location flexibility. The other line is the percentage that are full-time in office. So as you can see in January 2023, it was basically neck and neck, where 49% of companies required full-time in office, 51% offered work location flexibility. Those lines have steadily diverged over the months, and now full-time in office has dropped 10 points from 49% to 39% as of July, 10-point increase in offering work location flexibility. On the next slide, one of the questions that we get asked most often is, so where does this end up? Are we at equilibrium already in terms of the percentage of companies that are requiring full-time in office versus offering flexible work, or do we think that's going to continue to evolve? We think that one of the best ways to get a sense of that is actually not by looking at all companies, but rather looking at how this is evolving based on when a company was founded. So if you look at the left-hand side chart here, this is looking at companies by founding year. The top line, the blue line, is for all industries, including tech. The other line is excluding tech. We often do looks at both tech and non-tech just to make sure that we're not skewing the data, because tech is pretty overwhelmingly flexible in terms of posture. What's pretty interesting about this is it really starts to shift once you get past 2000. You can see those lines inflect upward in terms of the percentage of companies that are offering work location flexibility. Over the last 15 years or so, so if you look at 2011, basically the last 3 data points on the right of that chart, across all industries, 93% of US headquartered companies are offering work location flexibility. If you exclude tech, about 85% of US headquartered companies are offering work location flexibility. On the right-hand side, we did a similar look, but just looking at bigger companies. So companies that have 500 employees or more. While this is a smaller percentage of overall US companies, they disproportionately employ the US workforce. So it's another angle we like to look at as well. The trend is the same. So if you look at all industries with 500 plus employees, 86% are offering work location flexibility, versus if you remove tech, 80% offer work location flexibility. So there's a few really important kind of like insights or kind of implications of this. One, we think that full-time in office as a percentage of US companies is going to drop down to 15% or less. And what's going to cause that to happen is the confluence of a few of these data points kind of like working their way through over time. First is, with each passing year, based on this data, even if companies didn't change their policy at all, so every company today kept its policy into the future, just as older companies fade away and newer companies come in, the US kind of like firm base, if you will become more flexible. So just the passage of time, given that the companies that are getting founded now are more flexible, that will cause the percentage of US companies that are full-time in office to decrease. The second thing is, if you think about talent competition and what's happening at these companies, we wrote a report in July on job growth, and we found that companies that were requiring full-time in office were growing headcount at about half the rate of companies that were offering work location flexibility, whether you looked at it over the last 3 months or 12 months. So as companies feel that it is harder to compete for talent or kind of win top talent, we think that also will cause some shift toward flexibility. And the third piece is more real estate driven. The average US lease, I believe, is around 10 years long for companies. We're only 3.5 years into the COVID period, right? COVID started effectively in February, March 2020. And so over the coming years, we're going to see more unwinding of leases that were signed from pre-COVID as companies right-size their spaces accordingly. That will also create opportunities for flexibility in a way that I think will shift companies more toward flexibility. So that's a trend that we're going to be watching, and I think a pretty important one as we look into the future. On the next page, one of the things that we always look at or are interested in is, despite what feels like a pretty clear trend away from full-time in office, we're almost at Labor Day. And this will be the 4th Labor Day since COVID. And every Labor Day and running up to Labor Day, there are a bunch of articles that talk about, is this the year that we're going to see a big return to office with back to school and people coming back in September? Are companies going to change policy and people are going to spend a lot more time in the office now? And so for the first time in this report that we just released on Tuesday, we brought together what I think are probably the 3 best data sets on trended data related to return to office into one chart. One data set is our company policy data from the Flex Index. The second is Nick Bloom's SWAA data that they publish at wfhresearch.com on what employers and employees want, so more employee survey data. And the third is the Castle data on occupancy rates relative to pre-pandemic. As you look at this chart, the top line is what employers want in terms of the number of days in office on a weekly basis from January through July. You can see that it's relatively consistent. And in the most recent period, on average, Nick's data found that it was 2.75 days per week that the average employer wanted. The bottom line is what employees want, also from Nick's data. So you can see in July, 2.21 days in office. So there's about a little bit more than a half-point gap between what employers want and employees want. The middle line is our Flex Index policy data. So we pull that data from looking at all companies that require a minimum number of days a week and say, okay, well, what's the average number of days required in the office? A couple of really interesting insights here. One, policy already is in between what employers and employees want, actually shaded a little bit toward what employers want. So we've already found some equilibrium in policy relative to what each of those stakeholders are interested in. Second, even if policy were to pick up, let's say if the economy turned south or unemployment rate picked up, the likelihood is that it's only going to move a couple of tenths of a point based on what employers are saying they want today. I think that means that we are most likely going to end up in 2 to 3 days a week in office over the long term based on the balance that we're already finding. And that's why if you look at that row at the bottom, which is the Castle percentage of pre-pandemic occupancy, we're roughly flat year to date. So interestingly enough, while certainly there are individual companies that are asking for more return to office or changing their policy, year to date, return to office is actually relatively flat. And it gives me some belief that as we look on a go-forward basis, maybe we see a little bit of a tick up in policy or the amount of time spent in office, but I wouldn't expect much at all coming out of Labor Day. And lastly, on this next slide, one last point to make. We are increasingly seeing what I would describe as two major flexibility camps in terms of how people are approaching office requirements. One is for companies with less than 500 employees. So if you look at this chart, each row is a company size from less than 500 employees to 25,000 plus employees. And then we've got the three different types of models that we cover in the Flex Index. Fully flexible, meaning that employees are not required to come into the office. Structured hybrid, meaning that companies set a specific expectation on how much time is spent in office, and then full time in office. If you look at the 500 or less employees, they're overwhelmingly fully flexible, and they are embracing full flexibility for a number of reasons. One is a reduction in cost of real estate. Two is increasing the available talent to them. And the third is competing for that talent and trying to lure talent away from larger companies that are offering less flexibility. That's a different kind of approach than the second camp, which is larger companies that are increasingly embracing structured hybrid as their customer operations become complex, their company operations become more complex, cross-functional collaboration becomes more and more important. And so the two questions that I'm going to be watching or think are particularly interesting are, one, what happens when these small companies grow up? Do they feel the need because of more complex operations to be structured hybrid? Or are they born in an era where the tooling is better, the technology is better, their processes around operating remote or operating in a hybrid is better, and as a result, they can scale that full flexibility to later? And the second question is, what happens to the 500 to 5,000 employee companies that are getting squeezed from both sides? On the one side, they have smaller companies nipping at their heels, offering more flexibility to lure away their talent. On the other side, they're trying to scale their own operations and make sure they've got the right structures and processes in place to be able to compete and be effective as they grow bigger and bigger as a company. I think the answers to those questions are going to have a pretty big impact on how flexibility looks in the future. Does it become more and more fully flexible, or does it stay the way it is and structured hybrid becomes the go-to for larger companies over time? All right, I'll hand it over to Nick.
Thanks very much, Rob. It's fantastic to go through it. So I'm going to also go through 4 data slides. Kate, if you could go next, thanks. So, there's a theme coming through here in terms of, where have we come from, where are we heading? So here's another way of looking at what's going on. So the main graph, the big one, is the share of days work from home in the US. I like this as a measure because pre-pandemic, this was mostly binary. So I've been working from home for about 20 years now. Before the pandemic, you were basically either fully remote or fully in the office. Nowadays, as Rob has shown, it's a real mix. I'm sure Debbie's going to talk about it's a real mix. So I'd like to look at it day by day. If you look, what you see is before the pandemic, about 5% of days work from home in the US were 5% of days of work from home. As I show in a minute, the US looks an awful lot like Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, similar-ish to Northern Europe. During the pandemic, it jumped up to 60%. Probably everyone listening was fully remote. We kind of are all sheltering in place. It's dropped back down. The blue line is our SWAA data. We surveyed 10,000 people a month. Rob used a bit of that earlier. The red is the US Census. They have 40,000. The US government was kind of, slightly later to the party, but came at scale. They have 4x what we have. You see, we line up very well. Up above in the inset, I put Castle data. The big so what from all of this for me is going to build on what Rob said, which is over 2023, it is now flat. The data, the census, SWAA, Castle, all show the same thing. It is in British English, flat as a pancake. We're not heading back into the office, but we're not heading out either. It is completely level. I think it tells us that at this point now, by end of summer 2023, we are in the new normal. I would not expect any big changes. Intriguingly, we're heading to RTO, return to office, for September 2023. It feels like the last 3 years has been work from home 3, RTO 0. This is not a match that RTO is winning. So I don't see return to office having any shift. I should also say that, the news has been full of things like Zoom telling everyone apparently come back to the office, Grindr, Amazon, the Fed, etc. To the extent that this is true, and we can debate in the Q&A how much that's actual in theory versus practice, there has to be other firms heading out. I talked to literally hundreds of firms and managers and organizations, and some are coming in, some are going out. On average, we're about flat. Next slide, thanks. So here's another look. It's a cross section. So rather than over time, we're looking now across countries. We recently completed a big global survey. We survey around 30 to 40 countries every May. It kind of starts end of April, ends beginning of June. We've been doing this for the last 3 years. So this is the latest wave. We spent a while trying to figure out exactly how to group companies. This is one of these charts that looks like it was born this way, but we actually were looking at the data for a while and thinking, what are the common themes? Eventually, we came to the conclusion, if you look at it, it kind of looks most natural. I mean, maybe oddly enough, to group it by English-speaking Europe, Central and South America, and Asia. And in fact, that looks very similar to office occupancy data I've seen from JLL and others. So what you see is at the top in red, English-speaking countries, particularly US, Canada, UK, Australia, to a lesser extent, New Zealand, although the sample is smaller, have the highest levels of work from home. I put this up because you hear a lot of execs, I've heard this quite a few times, say, well, work from home is just an American thing. That's not strictly true. For a start, it's American, Canadian, British, Australasian. Secondly, it is lower around the world, but you can see even in Europe, these are days per week. In the US, it's typically 1.5, 2. In Europe, you're looking at typically just under 1. Central and South America, it's kind of just under 1. These, again, to be clear, for graduates. And then in Asia, it's down to about half. So yes, it is definitely low in Asia. The other thing to note is if you were to have surveyed this in 2019, the line would have been almost, 0. So there has been an enormous increase. The increase is larger in the US and Canada, but globally, we've seen this tick up. Next slide, thanks. So I put this up because of last week was a very busy week for me in terms of media and because of what happened with particularly on Zoom on Monday. So I know Zoom personally. I met Eric Yuan a couple of times. I went for lunch with him actually about a year ago. So I was in their head office and I asked Eric, there are a bunch of people around, like, what's going on? What's the plan? And he said, basically people are hybrid. So back in September 2022, they were hybrid. Eric announced, or Zoom announced formally, that people will come in the office for 2 days a week if they live within 50 miles. They would stay fully remote if they wanted to live further away. And there was a huge media storm. I think the issue was Zoom was, at risk. They were just formalizing a policy, but more generally, they're at risk on being on the off diagonal. So where I think firms should be is on the diagonal. So there are 2 flavors here. On the one hand, the top left is hybrid. So you pay for your space, you hire people locally, which say if you're in New York, San Francisco, or Chicago, is expensive. You're paying expensive city wages, but they come in, 2-3 days a week. You get lots of FaceTime, mentoring, innovation, and it's worth it. Bottom right is another strategy, fully remote. You don't have to pay for any offices, saves a lot of money. You can hire nationally or even globally, again, saves a lot of money. We're looking at maybe 50% cost savings. Maybe it's harder to mentor, maybe harder to, innovate, build culture. There's a debate over that, and I think good management really helps. But certainly this is also a very effective strategy. Where you don't want to be, which is what, the disaster is, paying for an office, paying really high salaries for, people around big US cities, but then not having anyone come in. That doesn't really make any sense. So it's kind of avoid the off diagonal. And Zoom was sitting a bit, risk of being in there as to other firms, and either they go to getting rid of the offices and fully remote, or they go hybrid. Next slide, thanks, Kate. So finally, this is a bit of a horrible slide. It's like we run our SWAA survey is monthly. We survey 10,000 people. We have like a steady set of questions, but you also ask, flavor of the month questions. And last month we asked people, well, so were you sick or injured in the last month? And 633 said, yes, actually, I was sick or injured in the last month. And mostly it was sick. And we said, so what did you do? And we gave them the options about when to work, worked from home or just didn't work. And at the top, you can see the folks that earlier in the survey said they could not work from home if they were sick or injured, mostly went into work anyway. So 76% went in. You know, maybe some of them are your colleagues. Maybe there's probably somebody, I don't know, who knows? You may have been sitting in an office or someone sick and came in, but that is not great. Really far from great. At the bottom, if you can work from home, you know, 39% of people still went in. That's not ideal, but 38% worked from home and the rest didn't work. And I think it highlights pretty critically for companies, if you want to better address and prevent future infections, pandemics, be more flexible, you need some work from home, at least hybrid, because it means if, you know, Debbie is really ill or I'm ill, and, you know, you can understand why people come in, they have a performance review at the end of the week or next week, they're stressed, they want to kind of feel like their best, they're worried that if they're not working, it won't look good. Being able to work from home is a really useful alternative in that situation. I can tell my manager, look, I don't feel great. They can maybe kind of sense it. I'd like to keep going. I maybe don't work a full day, but at least can do some of the critical things. And that flexibility should dramatically reduce infection rates. And I'll stop there and hand over to Debbie.
Great, thank you, Nick. Well, I will just chime back in and go to the data straight. Great to be here. Apologize for the voice. Nick was right, I was sick. But I'm getting better. I sound worse than I feel. So I could spend all of my 7 minutes on this one page. So I think I know we're asking the wrong question. It's not about return to office. It's about how do we make work based on the nature of the work and based on the nature of the individuals. And I think Ryan had a question in the Q&A to that point. Exactly. And so this is from our What the Flex survey you may have seen on LinkedIn. I prefer to call all of this the back part, which says making work. And, you know, and so we asked both, you know, individual contributors and executives, where do you do your best work, your most effective work? And we asked for affiliation development, interactive work, focus work, administrative work. For managers and executives, we added in coaching, team logistics, overseeing work. And everyone pretty much agrees that affiliation and development and interactive work is best done in person. They're dark green. Sorry, it's all green, BCG. And everyone agrees that focus work and administrative work is best done remote, the lighter color for a colorblind, the light green, right? And so the question isn't, what should our policy be? The question should be, where do we do our best work? And how do we enable teams at the team level and the manager to shape the work? Because the data showed we're actually pretty much in agreement about the percentage in person and the percentage apart. So if you go to the next slide, we also ask people how much time they spend in each of those tasks. And if you add up the preference to be your best, the time you spend, it comes to about, you know, 35% in person for individual contributors and 43% in person for managers and executives. So you could look at this graph and say, great news, we're all pretty much in agreement. So what's the debate about? Or you could look at this chart and say, wow, there's a structural difference between managers and an individual contributor. Why? Because the work is different. You have more focus work as an individual contributor. Managers have to oversee and coach and develop and mentor. And their old muscles tell them you have to do that in person, okay? The new muscles they developed over COVID was hard for most of them to do that across distributed teams. And so what we need to do is help. If you go back to the page before and you see the manager coaching, overseeing work, you know, a lot of them like to do that in person. And like, that's just one example of the many new muscles we need to make work, to teach managers at the front line to work differently. They need a new muscle to actually say, okay, it's 2 days a week, you know, 2.5, 2 to 3. How do we shape the work? So how do we actually decide what gets done where? and when and how, that's a new muscle. How do we coach and inspire teams across distributed environments? How do you send those little, notes during a Zoom? Good job, or great job. Couple things comments I have for how you could do even better next time. I'll give you a call, right? That's a new muscle that they have to build. So the work is different. The other thing that you see on this chart, which is fascinating, is that people are different. So even where I say we largely agree affiliation and development and interactive work is best done in person, there are 9 to 10% who actually want to be remote. Who are those people? Are they the introverts or the neurodiverse people who actually have a hard time in social environments? Are they the Black talent whose sense of belonging went way up during COVID? I know Brian's listening in. Our Future Forum data showed that, right? And so it's not one size fits all, even for a type of work. Again, a manager needs to think about not only the work, but their team. And on the flip side, for admin work and focus work, you also see 10%, 17% that rather be in person. Who are these people, right? They could be the older talent that grew up that way, or it could be your extroverts that just need to be around people, or people who don't have homes they could work from, right? And so there you need to think about providing WeWork like space, co-working. I saw there was a question in the questions about co-working space. We have to recognize the work is different and the people are different. And the conversations we should all be having is, how do we enable this? How do we build the muscle to manage in different ways? If you flip ahead a couple more slides here, the data on enablement around the work that we should be doing is disappointing, right? Again, from our same What the Flex survey, 43% of managers and executives disagree or are neutral that their organizations are giving them the support and training to support their employees who work flexibly. 41% disagree that senior leaders are role modeling the flexible work. Rob, I'd say your data about when did the company start also is probably a proxy for age and demographic of the executives who may have stay-at-home spouses, usually wives, right? And big offices, et cetera. So they're not role modeling. And then 53 disagree or neutral around we're reviewing our model and adapting it. This rethinking how work is done is new. And we have to learn our way there, which means doing the retro at the end of the week and saying, okay, here's how we did our 40% in the office or so. What worked, what didn't, what should we change for next week? And even if it all worked beautifully, well, we have a big deadline next week, so maybe it should look different anyhow, right? These are the conversations we have to be enabling. There's no room for crappy managers in today's world of really needing to think about how to make work work. And then finally, on the next slide, I talked about the small percentage that want to be remote. This is just data around how important flexible work options are, women versus men, caregiver versus non-caregiver, LGBTQ versus non, disabled versus not. And again, we have to recognize if you care about diversity, right, caring about working flexibly, even if like you believe this is the right way to work, we should all come back. You can't say you believe in diversity and still hold that view. All right, I'll stop there and pass it back to Rob.
Fantastic. I think we could probably spend, I'm guessing, the next 90 minutes if we wanted to, answering some of the questions and some really thoughtful stuff that's been written. I'm going to prioritize based on where I'm seeing the most engagement so far, or kind of common themes, and I'll kind of pass around and see who wants to answer what. But maybe the first one, the question from Stephanie asking, does it matter if employees and employers, if that gap closes between how much time they want to spend in the office? Is that something that is going to close, or is it important that it closes? Maybe Nick, I'll pass it to you first to answer.
So interesting question. So it certainly has closed a lot since the beginning of the pandemic. So in fact, when we were asking that data, we've been collecting that data all the way back to about, I think, June 2020. And you see what employees want is kind of flat, and what employers are prepared to give has risen a lot. But you're correct, there's a gap at about half a day. I think it tells you, it's very related to the slide Rob talked about, which, we all put out on LinkedIn actually, which shows that if you want to grow fast, one way to do it is to offer basically more days working from home, more flexibility. Why? Because on average, it's what employees want. So I think, there's a message for companies that the easier way to hire and recruit people is just to offer more flexibility. The number I often have in my head is when we surveyed folks, they say working hybrid is worth about 8% pay increase versus having to come in the office 5 days a week. And in fact, as Debbie said, it's going to be higher for various minority and groups that you're focusing on, particularly in DEI. In fact, that's one of the big issues, by the way, of some of the investment banks. They were trying to get folks in 5 days a week. Who turns out to, quit fastest is some of the folks you really want to promote with DEI. And so I think the message is for companies, for managers listening, one way to hire, and particularly hire with, in a diverse way without spending enormous amounts of money, is to offer greater flexibility, because what the average employee wants. They don't particularly want, by the way, 5 days a week. It's not that they want to be fully remote, but they certainly, want 2-3 days a week to work at home, 2-3 days a week to come into the office.
Great. Mike asked, is company size the best way to determine flexible trends as opposed to traditional industries like finance or legal? Maybe I'll take a quick stab at that, Mike. I think industry is certainly an incredibly important way of looking at this, and what feels like the natural balance in terms of the percentage of companies, or the percentage of time rather, that's spent in the office may look very different by organization. For example, we find in our Flex Index data that the industries that are most dependent on foot traffic, so think retail, food, restaurants, et cetera, tend to, even for their corporate employees, have higher rates of working in the office. Well, why is that the case? Well, you can be closer to customer physically, like you can actually see them in the store, better understand them. And there may be advantages to that, which are very different than a tech company, right? Where it's hard to see someone in the same way using your software, for example. And so I do think there will be natural landing points that look different across industry that also influence what you see at the size levels as well, based on what happens in that particular area. There's a really interesting conversation kind of evolving here that Ali had started around work from home versus work from anywhere. And what are you seeing in terms, and Nick, you had put out some global data too, but what are we seeing in terms of policy, and is work from anywhere becoming more popular? Debbie, I'm curious, you have a lot of great kind of like company examples of how this stuff is getting implemented, and anything on kind of like the work from home versus work from anywhere and flexibility that companies are allowing to work in different countries, maybe for different periods of time?
Yeah, I think there are two things going on. And I saw there was a question about WeWork going bankrupt and, work from anywhere. I want to separate demand for co-working space from poor company management, right? So there may be a little bit, perhaps, and I'm not close enough to know, but there certainly is demand for co-working spaces because not everyone has a home they could work from. And again, the extroverts want to be around people. They just don't want the long commute, right? So I think there is a need for that. The work from anywhere, like taking a week or a month of work in any other jurisdiction, I think a lot of companies are putting that in place. You don't read about them as much, in the headlines. The headlines you read about the ones that are forcing RTO more. I think that's guided more by tax and legal implications about working out of country. And so, the legal and tax implications need to catch up to the reality of the real, digital nomads that are out there that want to be working from anywhere and can.
That's a great point. Go ahead, Nick.
Kick out an idea. I totally agree. I'm going to kick out an idea I've heard from companies. I just don't see in the media. I think is fantastic on work from anywhere, which is for some companies, particularly have a seasonal model, having, let's say, 2 to 4 weeks of the same 2 to 4 weeks for the whole firm to be remote is really appealing. So take Stanford. We tend to be, there's not many students, a lot of summer camps, but not students typically around in the summer. So if you're involved in teaching or kind of those kind of student support activities, it's a very quiet 2 months. It's, hugely appealing for employees to say, look, you have to keep working, but you can do it remotely and the entire division can do it remotely for a month in August, because you're kind of not, you're not at 100% anyway. So, folks can go to Mexico or Barcelona or to their place in the woods, whatever it is, or retailers. I spoke to one that said, look, running up to Christmas is like a horror show, so it's like all hands on deck. January is really quiet. So a lot of the store, the head office staff, we just let them have 2 weeks. The second half of January, let them have 2 weeks work from anywhere. They're basically working at 50%, but it's kind of like a second holiday. And that's hugely appealing to recruits.
Awesome. I love that. Yeah. I love that. And, it just reinforces the point that I shared with my data at the beginning. You've got to make the model match the work, right? And you're just talking about the seasonal nature of the work, of course, right?
So in that same spirit around the seasonal nature, we talked a little bit already about Labor Day and how it's this flashpoint around discussion on what's happening. I think Scott had written in there's a comment around every Labor Day for the past 3 years, the Castle Index has jumped over 3% in mid-September. Nick, I know you've done some posting recently about how the Castle data for the last, I think, 4 weeks has kind of dropped a few points. And so curious if you want to comment on that or what you think is going to happen in September when we normalize.
No, I saw that point. So that point's probably correct. I haven't actually personally done the analysis. I guess what I've done is what I call the eyeball analysis, which I can't really see the bumps in Castle data and our data. It may well be there, like statistically, you may say it's statistically significant, but materially, put it this way, the debates, particularly in 2020 and 2021, is we're going to have this mass return to office. Everyone's going to be flooding back, and we're like at 30% occupancy, and we're going to jump up to 60. If all it did is went up 3% and then drifts back down again, I wouldn't call that a success if you're trying to fill offices. So what I've seen is a very smooth drop. I put it out on LinkedIn actually this morning. The long run thing I think is like a Nike swoosh, a very smooth drop. For Rob, the reasons you went through and also technology, it's going to start heading up again. So I'm happy to take a bet with someone that 5, certainly 10 years from now, we'll have higher rather than lower levels of work from home. I may not win it, but it's definitely 70-80% odds that we're going to be heading up. By 25, I suspect already we'll be up above what we are.
I'll see if we can get in touch with Jamie Dimon, and maybe he'll take the other side of that bet, and you guys can settle it up in 2030.
He can afford to lose, put it that way. So
and think about post Labor Day for a minute. For anyone who has kids, small kids, school's starting. You're putting your kids on the bus. You're taking them to their first day of kindergarten. Like, that is the hugest adjustment time for dual career parents. Like, to have that be the time where you've got to be in, not very employee centric.
Kelly asked a question, and Debbie, I'm going to direct this to you, that I thought was such an interesting one, which was around flexible work. And her question was, do you think that the failure to be adaptive as a leader leads to lack of full flexibility in larger organizations? Meaning, is there some need to control employee scheduling and leaders need to evolve in some fashion to be able to kind of get more comfortable or be more effective as a manager in that world?
I think that's exactly right. And pre-COVID, a big trend in business that was moving agile, or whatever you want to call it, which is, pushing decision-making down to the front line, fail fast, iterate, learn. And one of the biggest issues in agile transformations is the leaders, their willingness to let go, their willingness to give decisions, to be more local, right? Like there is this notion of a command and control, risk-averse leader that needs to be, we use the word generative, which is not the same as generative AI. Generative is, you need to have the mindset as a leader, how do I make everything I touch better off? The product, the people on my team, the community, right? And if you are of a generative mindset, which is a hard transition from, extractive, how do I get everything out of the people, right? Use people as a means to an end, sustaining work-life balance, generative, make everything better off. Like, that's a transition leaders need to make. And if they're able to make it, we would not be having this conversation at all, because of course, whatever the teams need to do their best work and live their best lives, of course. And it's not this trade-off, us versus them, employer versus employee, right? Productivity versus joy. They actually can coexist and mutually reinforce each other. And there's so much, I mean, Nick, there's so much academic data about high engagement, sense of, autonomy, what that does to value delivery. And, so we're getting into this us versus them, where I think if leadership, I could go on and on, I'll stop, but Kate, it's the exactly right question. Leaders need to adapt, and we won't be having this conversation.
Well, since you mentioned generative, obviously in different contexts, I feel like I've got to take the AI question that was asked in here. And I think Shujat from LinkedIn had asked about specifically AI and how does he think about how do we think about some of the influence that AI might have on where we head in this area? Nick, I know you've also spoken about potentially how different roles are impacted and how fully remote in different capacities might be impacted by AI. And so I don't know if you want to take the lead on some thoughts on the interplay there.
Yeah, I give a quick overview. I think it's a very high level point, which is if you look at automation, it's way better in terms of software and voice than it is in physical presence. So you could probably, if I was fully remote, you could maybe just replicate me with AI, right? You could, we know you can get close to do this image. You could do my voice. You could probably get much of the discussion from ChatGPT, etc. So fully remote, particularly relatively low level things like call centers, data entry, payroll, this stuff is at real risk of being replaced by AI in the next 3 to 5 years. On the other side, hybrid, if I have to go in and teach, meet people, present, the robots that do that, like enormously clunky, like 2,000 pounds, there's no way that any robot's going to look like a human even within the next 10 years. And it also doesn't have the empathy. So I think hybrid is actually more of a complement. If you're coming into the office 2-3 days a week, it's probably going to support you, make you more productive. I've seen a lot of my grad students use it, for example, for coding. If you're low level, fully remote, I think that's where we're going to see a lot of the impact. And I think the risk actually are more to countries like India, the Philippines, Mexico, South America, that maybe have more of this processing stuff and could see it. A friend of mine in the call center industry in India actually said already employment's going down because chatbots, which are terrible, they're like, the prior version of AI already. And if imagine if chatbots got, what's ChatGPT-3 with a smooth voice going to do?
Yeah, and if I could jump in just on this one, Rob, also, like there are two ways to think about Gen AI and technology. Like one is there are two forces that are disrupting what work is. One is everything we're talking about, flexibility of time, flexibility of place. Different employees need different things. We're not all equal. We learned that in spades in COVID, right? That's one force. The other force is technology and what is work? What is work? And both of those demand that we actually need to spend our time thinking about how do we reinvent work. Technology is changing what it is. All of the flex and human differences is changing what people need to be their best. That's hard. And I don't think it's so hard that I don't think any CEO or even executive team can solve that. The best place to solve it is closest to the team and the work and the action. What an executive team can do is provide the guardrails, the capability building, the tools, the platforms and support to do it. And so I think Gen AI and other robotics, right? Automation, because the other reason this conversation is wrong, and some people put it in the chat, it ignores the 70% of global workers that can't just bring a laptop home, right? And work, that are in factories, right? And if you think about what automation is doing in factories, we have to rethink work there. We can finally make that more humane. So it's a much bigger issue than this narrow days per week. And Gen AI just drives that as well.
It's such a good point. And if folks are interested in this topic, there's the organization Charter that's put out some really good research on the AI mandate for HR and how to start thinking about this. So happy to share that afterward too, if you're interested in this topic. Another one maybe for you, Debbie, from Isar that I thought was a really good one was around the middle manager. And I know that you and Brian Elliott from the Future Forum and BCG Research have done a lot of work on what do middle managers think, what are the pressures being put on them and kind of this in this world. And so would love for you to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, it's, the middle managers are in a tough spot. They're in a tough spot because they're getting, edicts from the top and demands from below, or needs from below, right? I wouldn't say their demands, their needs to deliver the work. And, and how do they buffer that, right? How do they buffer that? And, and also from a capability perspective, they tend to be ignored, right? And so one of, all these things we talk about rethinking what work is, that requires the middle manager to really have a set of capabilities that they don't have today. And that can't be ignored. And I think, again, and I said before, one of the things senior executives could and should be doing is really thinking about the role of the middle manager and how they can upskill them to really help their teams rethink work in a much more robust way.
That's great. All right. Tamar asked, it's a great research here. Curious if there's a sense of the future. Do we think 5 years from now, companies will still see this as a competitive advantage, or do we think offices will adjust and require people together more often? Maybe I'll take a first pass at this. I think you're going to see, as we mentioned, different flavors of this by industry and company size, but I do think you're going to see some alignment around roughly 2 to 3 days a week in the office. I think the big questions in my mind will be, how does that 2 to 3 days per week take shape? Is it a company specifying period of time to be together in office, or is it employees having some level of choice in terms of when that happens, either by team level agreement or every employee chooses? My instinct is there may not be a single answer on that. We talked about how it might differ by company size, but it also may allow for some self-selection. Some employees may want more office time in more structured environments and push that way. Some employees may choose that that's not for them. As Debbie mentioned, there are lots of reasons that could be the case. It could be extroversion versus introversion, how well you're set up at home to be able to work based on your own living dynamics. A whole bunch of other things may play into that. So I don't know if we necessarily need consensus on one model, so to speak. I think a lot more of the focus will be, how do you find what's right for you in terms of your working style and what makes that kind of like work best. I do think that even 5 years from now, you will have legacy companies that are still holding on to full-time in office. Like, there will be some holdouts against that. And so I think flexible companies will try and continue to pull from that group until they break it, so to speak. And my instinct is that probably still happening 5 years from now, but maybe 7-10 years from now, that stuff is largely kind of like worked its way through the US firm base. Nick, I'm curious, I don't know if you agree with that or not, but curious for your take.
No, totally. And I'm actually going to build on something that Debbie said earlier, which is pretty critical, which I think it very much depends on role. So already now what we see is big companies. Think of my own employer, Stanford. There's 20,000 people in Stanford. We have every which way. So we have, the US on average has about 60% of people that have to come in every day. So they're in all big companies, security, janitorial, food service, frontline retail, manufacturing. So they don't really have a choice at this stage. And then there's about another 30%, which we're mainly focused on, which are hybrid, which we've discussed. But I think that's clearly the way it's going to be for managers and professionals, probably most people listening. But then there's about another 10% that are fully remote. Stanford has a couple of thousand of fully remote employees, and it's working very well. They're doing mostly they're doing more kind of tasks like IT support, call centers, HR, payroll, but, we're hiring folks across the country. So I think big companies should be looking ahead to a future where all three coexist, and that's the way it is. And it's totally, as Debbie said, it's totally on task. If somebody is coaching, presenting, working with people you want to be in, if they're doing something kind of repetitive and it is more individually based, then it makes sense. Maybe they're at home 4 or even 5 days a week.
Debbie, who are some of the companies, just as you answer that too, like, can you share some examples or like folks that you think are doing this really well, even in different styles, whether it be structured or fully flexible, that maybe people could learn from?
Yeah, let me give you just some data, if I could, on the question before. And hi, Tamar. So just to the question of where will we be in 5 years? So very interestingly, a colleague of mine did a study of tech talent that's been laid off, right? And saw that of the 40% of the layoffs that are actually real tech talent, not the recruiters or marketers or more administrative roles, they're all getting jobs right away, And about half of them, if I'm remembering correctly, are going to small, fully remote companies. All right. So to Nick's point, they're voting with their feet to go to, fully remote companies that are more flexible than the big, Amazons and Apples that may not be as flexible. Another data point from the What the Flex survey that I didn't show was we asked people exactly that question, Rob, that you said, who's making the decision? Is it corporate? Is it your manager? Is it the team decides or individual decides? And if corporate's making the decision, it's like 26% are really unhappy with it. If it's the manager, it goes down to like 16% are unhappy with it. If it goes to the team or the individual, it's only 6% are unhappy, which means like if employees vote with their feet, and even if we're not in a low unemployment environment, you still know the value of a great employee, right? So if your best employees, if you care about their happiness, pay attention to that data about satisfaction and where the decision's coming from. I happen to believe the right decision is a team facilitated by the manager, not dictated by the manager. But, and so in terms of companies doing this great, I'm always told by our PR people not to talk about clients or individual companies, but I would just say there are a lot of big, old companies that are getting this right, and they're trying to be quiet about it because they want to keep their talent advantage. They actually want the Jamie Dimons of the world, and and the Amazons to be blurting, you must come back after Labor Day, because they're saying, listen, we all agree it's something like 40% for most of us, but work with your team and work with your manager to figure it out. And if you want to apply for a fully remote position, go ahead, apply for it. And there are companies actually that have been very public. Amex is an example about the number of colleagues that have applied for and received fully flexible, fully remote jobs, right? And that's a pretty, stuffy old finance company, right? But I'm going to try and be true. Sorry about that, PCG people, that I mentioned a company.
That's great. All right. Well, I think we could, as I mentioned, we could probably spend another hour on this. And I appreciate everyone's diligent reactions and responses to the questions. I feel like we covered a lot of topics in chat in addition to the things that we covered live. And so thank you for doing that. I will see if we can get a copy of the Q&A to be able to share afterwards. It seems like there's a lot of interest in it. But as we close up here, I just want to say a huge thank you to Debbie and to Nick, who are just always insightful and so wise on what's happening and where we're headed. So Nick and Debbie, thank you so much.
Oh, thanks for having us.
I will also say, if you would like to learn more about the topics that we covered, there are a few places I would send you. One, you can follow each of us on LinkedIn. I think we're all pretty active in terms of sharing our own data and insights and trends over time. So that's a good place to pick up on different things. Our reports on Flex Index we publish on our site, so flex.scoopforwork.com. You can also subscribe. We do a weekly newsletter with our research. Nick's SWAA data is available at wfhresearch.com, so you can find it there. And then Debbie, I think, regularly publishes research and insights in her Friday What the Flex series. I need to get one of those hats, Debbie.
I'll send you one for sure.
I need it. Lastly, as I mentioned, we will share the link to the recording, so it'll go out in our weekly newsletter. So expect that soon. And otherwise, thanks again for joining us. Have a great rest of the day, great rest of the week, and hopefully we can do this again soon.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.